Hello and welcome to another Denis Wick Products interview. And I'm delighted to talk again to Steven Mead, our second interview, but this time we're going to talk a little bit more about the Denis Wick products, which Steven's been heavily involved in. So welcome, Steven. Thank you very much.
Great to see you, Brett. Thanks for the great job you're doing.
Doing my very best. I am certainly trying. Right. So we're going to talk a little bit more about I think it's fair to say that you've been involved from almost the beginning, certainly the beginnings within the first decade. Yeah.
Yes. Well, I was playing a Denis Wick mouthpiece when I was 13 years old, so that's like prehistoric times. I don't think I predate Denis himself. No. And because his name was synonymous with mouthpieces back in those days, back in the 1970s, he was already a household name, and people would trust, just get a Denis Wick mouthpiece. It was like the obvious thing, what have you got? A cozy cup? All right, change that, get a Denis Wick. So, but I didn't really meet him till around 1994, 1995. Another mouthpiece company were interested to make some specialized cornet mouthpieces. And would I be interested to do a euphonium one? And I said, well, it's a nice idea, but I need to run this past, Besson and David Humphreys at the time. And I told him, I said, would you mind if we did some exploratory work? And he said, why don't you talk to Denis? And my first reaction was, well, great, but he's never had anyone else involved. Every mouthpiece has been a Denis Wick mouthpiece. And so he phoned him up. I was in Edgware with him. Oh, what a splendid idea. So absolutely no resistance at all. Get Steve to send me some drawings, get him to send me some ideas. And so armed with that responsibility, my goodness me. I mean, he could have just said, no, we're not, yes. They don't look very good. It's got two cups or it's got a hole in the shank. But I just went away and just did some drawings, based on my gut feeling that what I had then was, I think I had a cozy cup mouthpiece. It was one of the,
And so is that you were playing on the cozy cup at the time you were talking to Denis Wick, or you were playing on, say, a trombone mouthpiece? I just wondered what you were playing on before that.
Yeah, my first mouthpiece was a cozy cup. So by then, so from the age of 15, I actually, for some reason, decided to get a 3AL. So I was on a pretty big trombone mouthpiece. No one told me it was slightly bigger than what most people play. I just thought, well, I just got to breathe a bit deeper and practice a bit more. So that was my go-to mouthpiece. Yeah, sorry, I missed out a couple of decades there.
No, that makes sense then. So from that and that trombone design, you then did some drawings on what is then the SM design, if we call it that, of the classic euphonium mouthpiece.
Yeah. So all I wanted was a mouthpiece that, basically, I was really happy with the mouthpiece I had, but I thought here's a unique opportunity, and it may be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to work with a company like Denis Wick Products. And so I noticed on the mouthpiece I had that there was like a cutaway at the bottom here. And I just thought, well, I don't really know much about mouthpiece design at that stage. Maybe some people say I don't know anything now. It's all guesswork. But I realized that to have the narrowest point of a mouthpiece here was definitely going to have an impact on it. So I think I spoke to Denis on the phone, and I said, Denis, do you mind me asking why was there that ridge on the AL series? Oh, purely cosmetic. So the piece of metal was spinning round when they're making the first mouthpiece. And I think the first one looked a bit like this. And he thought, well, it looks a bit plain. Can you do something fancy about here? And that became the AL series. So I loved it. But what I wanted, I guess, was just for the euphonium was a little bit more core sound. I loved the rim edge, but I also said to Denis, why is it that on the mouthpiece I'm playing, the edge is a little bit severe? And he said, well, it was designed for him and his colleagues sitting in the orchestra, where after 60 bars rest, you pick up your instrument and you have to play without, couple of arpeggios, you have to hit it cold. And that slightly more severe edge meant that he could feel it immediately. And he said, yes, absolutely. He said, I won't do the accent, that would be unfair. But absolutely, if as a euphonium player, you're sitting in a band, you're playing all the time. the only time you rest is in between pieces, basically.
Yeah.
Which we need for the lips. So I came up with a rim edge, which was just kind of a little bit more shaped. And as soon as his guy made it for me, and I put it on the lips, I thought, well, that's for euphonium players, that's already an improvement. That's a bit more comfort. We can feel it, but it doesn't have to dig in, so that we play cold, after counting for 5 minutes or 10 minutes. And so really the first drawing I made was something like this. It was basically a large French horn mouthpiece. I drew on a piece of paper. What about the inner dimensions? And it's like, goodness me, it's like asking me to solve algebra in my head. It's like, well, quite happy with what we've got, but maybe we could just, and it was all maybe, somebody who's never designed anything, you don't have that arsenal of techniques and approaches that work in different combinations. It was really interesting, because it was a new outer shape, and there were people around the factory then that said, well, changing the outer shape doesn't make any difference. It's what's inside. Even Vincent Bach is quoted as saying that. And I thought, well, I think it does change, because if you put more metal here, it's going to add a bit more metal, a bit more body to the sound. If I reduce this shape here, that's going to make a lighter approach for the lips, but maybe it won't handle the bigger dynamics so well, and so forth. And so I had some gut feelings. I mean, this was 5 years after I left Desford. So I'd been through all that chapter. So I kind of knew what playing was about, but never really thought about the mouthpiece. Somebody told me in 1985, my mouthpiece, in fact, the original mouthpiece is still here, sitting pride of place. So this is it.
Yeah. Okay.
This is the 3AL that went through all my Desford days, went through my university days, and I've had offers for it, but it's too personal, this one.
Yeah.
So,
so that would have been about 1989, 90 that you left Desford, I think.
That's right. Yeah. November 89. Yeah, just after the hat trick. What a good time to leave. But I was already going to professional, seeking out professional opportunities, the Royal Academy, Royal Northern. So the thought of being around, for Desford rehearsals, and Jimmy Watson got wind of that, and we kind of made the decision together. So that was my go-to mouthpiece. And somebody asked me, would you think I'll ever get another mouthpiece? I remember saying, that's it for life now. That's it. Why change? It feels great. And so yeah, I remember that conversation very well. And so we came up with this, what we just called it, the SM, the Steven Mead mouthpiece. And I met Denis in Edgware in 1995. There are some pictures around with me in a rather interesting smoking jacket, and Denis in a very fine suit.
I've seen them on the internet. I've seen them on social media where exactly.
And Denis was fantastic. He said, well, let's see. And of course, it was the first time that the word euphonium had appeared on its own in the catalogue. Trombone also suitable for euphonium. Good size mouthpiece for trombone, and also popular with. So, of course, with benefit of hindsight, my goodness me, of course it should be. But at that time, I think they had tenor horn mouthpieces then, and obviously flugel, and cornet, and trumpet. But euphonium was, and conical cylindrical instruments. Okay, some people tell me, oh, I play this on a trombone, or et cetera, and vice versa. So there are people who find mouthpieces suitable that perhaps they shouldn't, but that's the basis of testing a mouthpiece. We can prescribe this will work for you. So that was 1995, and it was very popular, and still is. I still see videos and pictures of people playing. Wow, there it is. Is it a 3.5? Is it a 4? Is it a 5? We sold some SM2s to tuba players who had to do a bit of doubling, because there wasn't a bigger euphonium mouthpiece than an SM2.
And that procedure, I was going to say, where you sort of said, okay, well, so we'll go from, say, a 2 and we'll have 4.5, and because they're 3.5. Was that a really difficult discussion, or did you just think, right, well, we'll just take the templates from the trombone mouthpieces, or how did that go about?
Yes. Well, in terms of the internal dimensions, I mean, I can't tell you for sure that the 4AL is not internally the same as an SM4. But there are some similarities. The euphonium is a little straighter and the 4AL is a little bit like that. But in terms of the depth, I didn't want to have a 4 mouthpiece that was so much deeper or shallower than a current 4, because people will say, well, that's a 4, but inside it's a 2, or it's a long 3 or whatever. So I wanted to keep, and I think for the sake of the catalog, it made sense, having numbers that didn't really reflect how it felt wasn't an option. So we obviously, there are 1.5 mouthpieces out there in some companies, but definitely the 2 was going to be the biggest. I immediately thought that I would play, and I did. I played the SM3 because I would been playing this wonderful old 3L forever, and so I wanted that same feel on the face. I only went to a 4 somewhere around 2014.
Okay.
As you get older, and you're only using half of one lung, you need to get help. So we went down. I think we did an SM6, a 5, a 4, a 3.5, a 3, and a 2. So the 6 was to cover people who basically like that lighter sound or need a lot more assistance with high register. But we never went as shallow as some of the kind of German style 6 mouthpieces for the baritone, because treble based sound, I almost like, well, there's already mouthpieces out there for that. I want to design a range of mouthpieces that make the euphonium sound great, and so to make a small mouthpiece that didn't sound great, it just felt wrong.
Well, and I guess you've also got the situation where I would suggest, and I'm sure you'll agree with me, there's a Besson standard of shank and size of mouthpiece, but then you also have some makes out there from other manufacturers that I won't mention, but they're actually smaller shanks.
Yes.
So did you ever sort of think, oh, well, maybe I should look at that, or?
Yes, we did. We made some M shanks, but not immediately, because I was never really sure how many companies that we can't mention, how many of their players actually would. But of course, if it was going to be a decent number, if it was going to be 200 or 300 a year, then we should definitely do it. But with the Ultra series, we definitely went to medium shanks pretty much straight away.
Yeah, which brings me on to the next point. So how did you go from the classic SM model to the Ultra? What changed there? Why did you sort of think, I want a totally different look to the mouthpiece?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, every step of mouthpiece development I've ever done has been very selfishly what would help me as a player. Because if it helps me, it'll help other people. I don't think my playing is particularly weird or off. So I wanted to find something that helped me. And I also talked to a lot of players, like, why don't you play one of my mouthpieces? What's that? Why are you playing that? And so you listen to players, and I was, and I still am, traveling a lot. And so I found people that would prefer a bark mouthpiece or would prefer, et cetera, et cetera. And I said, well, do you want to try this? I like it, but I need a bit more attack. I don't find it positive enough in the high range or whatever. So there was a myriad of things. It's actually harder to make a really big core sound. And the British brass band movement has exported itself very well, as has the Denis Wick sound. But there were certainly some markets, and maybe it was my desire to get into the American market or with the Japanese, because they like heavy stuff at the front of a mouthpiece. They like something that, is almost like a substitute or an additional tongue to make the note speak. Whereas this, you can just breathe into it. But it really still doesn't suit all the players. So I thought it is an opportunity to create another opportunity, obviously for the company to sell tens of thousands of mouthpieces again, but for people who didn't really take to the original mouthpiece, maybe you would like this one. We develop fans for both, so you can see it's a really pretty radical difference in shape. And to be honest, if I was blindfolded, I wouldn't know which mouthpiece the player was using. Not really. I'd have a good guess because the internal shape of the player, the way their teeth form, the way their air moves, the way their lips vibrate, thick or thin lips, is obviously a huge factor. But something that had this extra weight here for me allowed me to play clearer in the high range, a little bit more symphonic sound, but still able to sit in a brass band and resonate every time the conductor does this. You know, no problem, sir, lady. So and that took off, and I got into markets. And so the original Ultra mouthpiece made a fantastic sound. It was actually quite deep. We went slightly deeper than the SM range. I wanted something that had a big attack. And so that was 2008. So it was 13 years after the SM came out. And I didn't really imagine it happening, but a series of discussions down in Poole, I think by then, were, what do you think? Do you have any ideas? And so I came up with this. It took a whole year of prototypes. The first one they made that I drew was very similar to this, but what to do with this piece? You know, you see some trombone mouthpieces that have a double neck here. I even had one, so this one, not this exact one, but it's here somewhere, was the 10th prototype. It had number 10 written on it. And there were about 2 months between each one. And the first one was pretty good. Second one, the third one was like wrong direction. Fourth, this is interesting. And I used to get my kids, actually. So at that point, they were around mid-teens. They were like 13, 14 years old. And both musical, both playing the piano, both responded well. So I used them as sounding boards. I had my own idea, but I used to get them to sit in the kitchen with the chairs turned around. Okay, Daddy's going to play 4 bars. This is mouthpiece 1. This is mouthpiece 2. Which one is best? And both, they always said the same answer, whatever it was. Number 1 is better. Okay, that's my old one. Number 2 is better. Yeah, that's my old one. And then really about 11 months later, I had a feeling that this was it. And they kind of went a bit quiet. And like the best adjudicators ever. And then they said, we think that your old one is number 1, but we like number 2 better. And at that moment, it was like white smoke, you know. It was really funny. They still remember. We still laugh about it. So there was something about the richness of sound, and so it was good. But subsequent years told me that people said, "God, I love it, but it's really hard work because it's very deep." And so I went back to Denis and Steven and Brian in Poole and said, we may need to pull the depth back a little bit, because strong players can really cope with it. Other players complaining they're a little bit fatigued here, not getting through a rehearsal. It's like, oh my gosh, you know what? And so he said, well, you know, compare it with other mouthpieces. So I got 3 or 4 others in, and we were way deeper. I mean, we were 3 millimeters deeper than other mouthpieces for the same size. And I still meet people, you know, James Blackford, this amazing Australian at RNCM, who's doing great. He plays on a 4U mouthpiece, the original U mouthpiece, and sounds absolutely unbelievable. There is one of the most gorgeous sounds that's around at the moment. And I asked him if he'd played the X. He said, yeah, but I went back to the Ultra. So there are fans of it, just as there are for the original SM. You know, people like Thomas Rudy. I can't give him an Ultra or an Ultra X. He likes his SM3, you know? And he said, I just keep going back to it. So, you know, that's great.
And everybody's different. And so, I mean, that's the great thing, is that there's so many options now people can look at to find what's best for them. But then we've gone one further with an XR.
Yes.
So I assume that's with the rim.
Yeah, the R is the rim. So there's a really, really interesting story about that. It's almost like a confession. I was playing the X, I was playing the 3X, and then around 2006, 16, I picked up a sore on my lip right before a couple of big concerts in Germany, and it was just painful as hell. It wasn't the mouthpiece's fault. I'd done something, and I couldn't play the 3. It was really painful, but the 4 worked perfectly. It was even that, millimeter just meant. So I got through this. I was playing Bliss, actually the piece I'm playing next week in Thailand with brass band. Very physical, all over the instrument. I got through it okay. And so I changed then to the 4. And then in January, February, when I felt better, I went back to the 3, and it was like, I think I'll stay on the 4. So that was an interesting moment. But then some years later, I think 2 or 3 years later, I was playing I was doing one of the first performances I ever did of the UFO concerto, Johann Demay. Great piece. But it sits at the top of the stage basically for 22 minutes and then goes up to Super G at the end with lots of quiet, nasty, high stuff. Well, it sounds beautiful, but quite nasty to play. Hangs around on top C, And so I found that I was really struggling for stamina, and normally people know that it was, but hands up, I was struggling a little bit. So I had a mouthpiece upstairs in my mouthpiece box that I knew I'd owned for 10 or 15 years. I picked it up, I think it was in Spain somewhere, and it was really shallow. And so I got this mouthpiece one night, put it in and go, right, next Saturday, I'm playing it on that. It narrowed the sound for me a little bit more than I wanted, but I got through it and I sailed up to the high G at the end, but it wasn't a mouthpiece I was going to stay on. So I came back to the company, talked to Brian, talked to Steven, said, look, I think the thing I like about this mouthpiece is that the rim is really comfortable. Well, so they look at it and they made some prototypes of the X with this rounded rim, and 2 or 3 different kind of, it's really hard here whether we can see, because this one is the original SM rim, and then you have this rounded one of the R. So actually we didn't steal the rim, but we borrowed the idea of a more chamfered edge with the X cup. I think we may have moved the internals, but the smallest amount. And as soon as people put it on the lips, if you don't feel the edge, it's because it's not pressing in. I mean, it's there. And so that's done really, really well. That's done really well. The 4X is probably the biggest selling mouthpieces. We have 3s, 4s, and 5s XRs. And the nice thing is that there are devotees now of each of the models, the XR, the X, and the Ultra, and obviously still the ALs, especially with trombone players.
And when you said you changed the internals a little bit on the XR, do you mean you made them smaller or bigger?
Slightly smaller.
Slightly smaller.
Yeah. We wanted a mouthpiece that was going to be really impregnable to being defeated in stamina and high range. So the nice thing is that you can do a computer printout of the exact curvature of the cup. And he said, this was the SM, this is the X. So what do you want to do? And I said, cool. And literally almost like with a piece of, filing paper, said, look, I want that to be a bit smaller there. And because look, otherwise you could just say, well, it's just the same. It's just around a rim, but we did play around with it. I mean, really small, but I can tell the difference. If I play on an X and an XR, it's not just the rim. There's like a little bit of extra joy, power in the higher register. So it resonates a little bit more. But every player will test it. And that's, so that, if you like, that's the sequence from 95 up until around 2017, 18, where the XR came on stream.
And related to all of this, if you think about a new player out there, they've had a euphonium for a few years. They've been playing on the mouthpiece that was in the case, which I'm sure you come across a lot. And so they're saying, well, I'm struggling a little bit. What would you suggest? So where would you start them off, bearing in mind there are so many options these days?
Gosh, it's a hard question. Well, you certainly I don't like, as long as the student has normal air supply, and is not, a really tiny player, I wouldn't really go on hand on heart smaller than a 4. Now they may start on a 6 or they may start on a 5 and everything's working. And you say, look, you're doing really well. Your sound's nice and clear. Maybe next year, talk to your teacher. Maybe you can step up a size. But now, frankly, I don't know why people don't all play on a 4, but only because that's my medium size. It used to be a 3. There are many players in America who like the 5. It may be a slightly deeper 5 than we have, but so, anywhere between 3 and 4 and 5. I mean, really, the question is, if the student has a good airflow and a decent high range, then get on a good medium size mouthpiece. I don't like these ideas. Well, my teacher wants me on a 3 because he says it's a really big sound. You don't really win contests by having a big, enormous sound. You win by playing musically, and that means control right across the range, all dynamics. So I think that's the most important thing. If you're working with a good teacher, a teacher, so long as they're not just trying to sell you something, God forbid, a teacher will say, look, this is working. You do need to expand your sound. Or they may say, you've gone on a 4 and you're only 13. Let's take a step back and use a 5 to get the airflow and get some strength in the embouchure and improve confidence as well. So, yeah, as you know from teaching, Brett, every student is different. They'll come in the room, the same instrument, and from that moment, everything changes. Their approach to music, their approach to practice, how they use air, the stress they carry around in their body, whether they practice in a regulated way 2 or 3 times a day, or whether it's 3 hours every 3 days. They're all different. So we can advise in the end, I think giving them opportunities. And if it's, why do you play that mouthpiece? It's the one that came with the case. That's a fine opportunity to say you can do better than that.
Yeah. And would you suggest for a player that's, let's say they could be on a plastic mouthpiece for all we know, and then we're going to give them their first really good quality mouthpiece that's going to transform their sound. Would you start them off on an XR, or would you say, well, actually you need to start on something like just the Ultra? And I know this is a difficult question because everybody's different, but I just wondered, there's a lot of people that will watch this and they'll be saying, okay, so where do we go from here?
We're now, with the benefit of hindsight, Brett, the regular Ultra, the slightly deeper Ultra, is really for the mature player who really wants the finest wine with their meal, and doesn't mind if they sleep afterwards. It's not the regular Ultra. I don't think is for a young beginner player because of the depth. But in terms of the X or the XR, so similar. It's really put it on the lips. And which one do you prefer? I like the feel of this, is so comfortable. And you've got the same diameter. So that's an interesting one. I know players still who love the SM4, but there are a lot of players now, and their teachers too, who require a certain amount of assistance with the attack, and that little bit of extra metal really helps with that. You'll find old teachers who just love the way things were in the 70s and 80s, just say, 4AL, lad, you'll never need anything else. Just practice Arbon and 4AL. And especially in the UK, there are a lot of people like that. And if the players end up sounding beautiful, you can't argue with that. You really can't. I've met some young players on equipment like that have had very regimented teaching, very disciplined, and sound great. Now, maybe they'll progress on to a mouthpiece that has more potential for range, for example. If you only ever play Arbon, you've never played above top C. So what are you going to do with pantomime? Turn it upside down?
Which is an option, yeah.
Sounds weird with the accompaniment. They'll all have to do it.
Well, no, that is absolutely wonderful. Thank you very much for your time, Steven. There's a lot of people that I know are going to take a lot of interest in this video. So thank you very much for your time, and have a great trip overseas tomorrow.
Thank you, Brett. Yes, heading off to Thailand tomorrow. So Should be fun. That'll be old news maybe by some people, by the time some people have seen this. But
Yes, that's right.
it's really, it's great to talk. I've done a few interviews over the years where people have asked specific questions about mouthpieces and, you know, Denis Wick, but it's nice to go through that kind of cycle of events, because it's, yeah, and who knows what the next one will be.
Absolutely. And that will be, I am sure, our next interview. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.